right. Hello, Jim Galindo. How are you today in Sydney? Is it a nice day?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Uh, I am here in New York City still, though my backdrop shows where I would like to be, which is on a plane to Hawaii. um, but Jim and I have tried the video on this session, and it doesn't necessarily add to the conversation necessarily to see our faces on a backdrop. Um, and unfortunately, the Australian internet is below subpar, and so I'm going to blame Australian internet, not Jim, not Verizon. But if it gets too bad, we may pause or we may just switch off our videos. So.
Yep.
Cool. Well, first of all, that's a bit of a long intro. I want to welcome everyone else besides you to the Driving Optimism podcast. This is actually our first episode, so it's pretty exciting. Last week was our pilot, so congratulations. We showed up again.
Yeah. Congratulations.
And so Driving Optimism is a podcast about problem solving. And last week we talked about what that meant to us, what optimism meant to us. And I want to give just a little bit, that show is available on YouTube. The housekeeping around the intro today is that other podcast platforms are coming. Instagram and Twitter are up. Twitter's not as active as we would like it to be, but we'll get on that soon. It'd be a great place to start to interact and get questions and comments from folks. Though YouTube nasty comments are expected because we have gone to YouTube. And then the website's pending.
Constructive criticism is what we're going to call it.
Yes. So, I wanted to just kind of quickly talk about last week when we defined optimism, because I think we went all around on that topic, which is great, but I also did want to leave people with something that is slightly optimistic. So I was thinking during the week, what's a pithy little quote about optimism that can kind of summarize how we see things. And Churchill said that the pessimist sees the negativity in every opportunity, and the optimist sees the messed up the quote. Do you have it, Jim?
I do. It is the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty, which is a good way to see things.
Yes, and I was speaking to one of the handful of people who listened to the first podcast, getting some feedback, and one of the things that they heard, which I thought was very interesting, which was one of the things we were saying about optimism. It's really optimism is the ability to thrive in adversity, and
Yep.
it's the ability to take adversity and just find a way through by by kind of finding that opportunity in the difficulty.
Yep.
So that was last week. Now this week we want to dive a little bit more into family and community. So I'm going to pass the mic to you, since I kind of helped us redefine optimism a little bit, and let you talk a little bit about defining what family and community means to us in this situation. So
Yep. So extending on last week, we talked about family, and family is defined as our relations, our blood family, but then there's also our found family, so our friends and the peers that we find, neighbors, things like that. But also then there's a community, which is the extension of that network, is the people within our network that know those people that we don't know. So community is that cohort and extends beyond that are within a distance of you in terms of relationships that could be part of your life. You can help them, they can help you, or they can connect you with people in the same way. It's about helping each other, and it's those opportunities to solve problems, and people to help you solve those problems collectively and together to be a community.
Yeah, and you're talking about the physical manifestation, of course. Now there's obviously lots of online communities as well that have a similar function. So we'll go more into detail about that But this, as I said, since we're talking about driving optimism, and this is a podcast about problem solving, particularly around solving for the family, community, and really how solving some of those problems. And I don't mean day-to-day problems. I mean how kind of macro problems come in and affect our small environments, like our family environments or our community environments, and then this IED. But you and I did say, I think last week, in talking about this podcast, we didn't necessarily want to talk about kind of what's happening currently. But we rethought that this week, and you'll hear some sirens going off behind me, perhaps, and I'll just leave that audio in because it's relevant. But it is the coronavirus time, and this is a relevant time to solve problems and to be creative and to be optimistic about some of the things. So we actually thought today we're going to test ourselves. So we both put in rules. Jim, what is your rule about talking about the coronavirus?
We don't want to get political.
Yes.
That's probably, and then you actually had, I like your rule a bit better than my rule, which is your rule is?
My rule is, I've said on the notes, no Monday morning quarterbacking, which is a very American expression, and it's also a very hetero male expression. So let me just translate that to people who are not American, American heterosexual males. So Monday morning quarterbacking is really looking kind of naysaying quickly thereafter a football game about all the things they should have and could have done wrong, as if you would have given that advice in the first place.
Yeah. So if you're an Arsenal fan in the UK, or if you're a Barcelona fan or any other sport, post game, you and your friends are getting together and complaining about what the coach did wrong or what the team did wrong and what you would have done differently to win the game, even though acting like you had some sort of influence over that, right?
And you had pre-insight, and
yes,
and also
hindsight, yes,
correct. And I think the thing is, I put this rule for myself because this is a habit I have. It's like a bad habit, so I had to stop myself from doing it because you know what? It's just not relevant right now. All that stuff's not relevant right now. So, with that said, before we kind of get into, we are going to talk about the coronavirus today. We're going to talk about how it affects the family on, the levels that everyone's been talking about, kind of give our perspective on it. But before we dive into how it affects work and home and kids and yourself, we wanted to talk about, Jim and I are both, I'd like to describe ourselves as change agents, I think. I'm sure someone is rolling their eyes as I say
probably,
that term.
Yes.
So that's fine. But, I think someone that's a change agent is the person that can see through the pain of the change to the other side. And then they're the people that have to explain the benefits that can come on the other side. Now, we had not been in these contexts before, so please no one say that I think that there's a good benefit. But, there's a few things. So I did want to talk about silver linings for a little bit, and what good can come of this, and have that discussion with you. So to me, the first thing I've been thinking about, I was thinking small, and then I started thinking a bit bigger, and realized actually the fact that the economy has been shut down, the fact that planes aren't flying, the fact that school has been shut, within a week or whatnot. Again, these are kind of generalizations of what's happening, but these are things that we would never expected could happen. And so now that people see that things actually can change instantly for circumstances, I'm not saying we should take planes out of the air willy-nilly every day, but it gives us this chance, these are possible. We never thought it'd be possible to change how often we flew or traveled in order to sacrifice for the coming generations for the purpose of climate change. We never thought that was even conceivable. So now that we've conceived it, that making what was unthinkable possible gives us this optimism to allow us to actually tackle the problem. I think. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of start with some of the good things. And
it's a common theme in history too, where significant social upheaval presents opportunities to change. And you see, in the 1800s, democracies kind of starting to pop up because of revolutions that happened in the late part of the 17th century and things like that. World War One is a huge, significant change event. The stock market crash after that, World War II as well. Like, so it's prevalent throughout history. So this is the time where we need to recognize that people are changing their daily habits by force of nature rather than force of politics. And it's a better opportunity, I think, than because you're going to get less resistance. And that's where the opportunity lies. I mean, obviously there's some negative aspects to this, and hopefully we can mitigate those in many ways, but really there is a big opportunity on so many fronts. And that's where we're aiming to talk about a number of those things over the next few podcasts, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else come to mind for you as far as what are the bright sides of Corona times?
I think it's going to make us care about each other more. Like, some of the, not to talk politics, but some of the discord between people because of partisanship, now we're going to see people suffering that we care about that may be on the other side of the fence, and it'll bridge that gap. Like, I'm really hoping this is a glue that brings people and brings us together. That's probably the one thing I'd really like to see out of this, and a number of other things around community and well-being. And then there's the mundane things like, working from home, which seems mundane in comparison to what's really going on. So being able to collaborate people in different ways globally, it's changing how we work. All that stuff that we all know about that's already happening.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned the work from home. I mean, I've always been a big fan, more of a fan than you even.
Yep.
And so it's been fascinating for me to watch and see how that has come over. And that's something that I'd love to talk about, again, in another podcast, because I think we want to get to some of the kind of more family focused things. And again, I guess just to kind of echo what you had said, I agree as well. I think scarcity breeds clarity. It's not my quote, but I've heard it, and I think it's very helpful. And so I know for myself, things that are important have become much easier to tell when before they seem to all be shouting for the same attention in my brain. But, priorities have changed, possibilities have changed, even if they are temporary. And so It does give you, I think, it can be overwhelming, the uncertainty, but it can also be something that you can use to focus and simplify, which is always
something. Yeah. I think people are coping, they're not coping well with it just yet because of confined spaces with their family and stuff. And it's cabin fever and all that stuff, but people will learn to accept that the world has fundamentally changed.
Well, hey,
it'll open them up to those opportunities, right?
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but let's get on to that concept of how things have actually changed in the house. And so one of the things that I shared with you that will be in the show notes as they eventuate is there's a CNN article about coronavirus, and it's actually how to save your marriage in coronavirus. So I sent it over to you because, I've been reading a lot of these relationship articles in coronavirus and managing human connection and working from home, best practices. I really, we've all been reading way too much news and way too much side news to distract us from the depressing news. And so, they're pretty much the same. But this one I actually thought was pretty good, though the name was the same as all of them. And so I'm just going to highlight actually a couple of things, and then I'll bring us into some of the themes as well for the rest of the podcast. But obviously it starts with communication. But I thought the interesting point that they made about communication was accepting that people, and this doesn't have to necessarily be a romantic relationship. It can be all of the relationships within a household, family or not family, that are in a quarantine. Everyone's going to be dealing with this differently. And there is no point in changing people's coping mechanisms. We have to support each other in how we cope. And that sometimes is just communicating and being okay with it. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. I know you liked the second one, so I'll...
Oh, sorry, I don't have which one's the second one?
The second one was about the space, being in your space.
Oh, yeah, because it's I mean, just from a personal perspective, like, I'm upstairs, my family's downstairs, isolating while I work, but thinking more towards my family, those spaces that you have where, my mother and my sister are in a pretty big house together, and they're, they have a traditional mother-daughter relationship. There's a bit of friction there. So they've isolated pretty well, and it's helping them regulate their emotions, and they're keeping to their own space, and it's going reasonably well, but it's difficult too, because, you're also, my family gets to see me in a work environment now, and that can produce some funny outcomes. If you look on the internet, you see some tweets about people discovering, I didn't know my husband or my wife was that, let's circle back around type of person. So you're, and they're making fun of themselves, which is great. And there's a great humor and opportunity in that to get to know each other. But, finding those mechanisms to regulate your emotions, and distance helps with that. But how do you find distance in a confined space? And so we're closing doors and meeting for family functions, and I'm helping with the schooling of my son, and we're doing that purely in the living room. So we're kind of cording ourselves off.
Yeah, which is definitely the recommendation.
Manage those sorts of things. It's difficult because we live in an apartment. We're lucky that it's 2 floors, but still it's an open plan living space. It's difficult.
Yes. So I'm glad you said open plan living space, because I think that's the point, just to wrap up this point, is that open plan sucks, whether you're in corporate or at home, right?
Yeah.
It's just not the way to work. And so don't feel bad about putting on headphones at home. You're not being rude. You're actually, and I would even go further and say, don't only be quiet and kind of be in your own space, like calm your energy down and don't throw around that stuff, because everyone has to work without walls. And actually, there are a few instances when walls are helpful. What is that? What is a quote about fences? Good fences make good neighbors, or something?
I'm not familiar with that one. We'll have to look it up later.
It's a fence, right? It's not a wall. It just means like,
It's a fence.
I don't see what you're doing. You don't see what I'm doing. And so we get along.
Yeah.
So that was good. I agree. So, hey, there's a couple other things in this CNN article that we'll link to. But to me, the funniest one along the lines of kind of dealing with work was they suggested creating an imaginary coworker.
Oh, yes, that was great.
And Cheryl steals all the chocolate in the house and then leaves the wrappers around, and she's not really that reliable. So, Cheryl's unfortunately hasn't really been the best collaborative coworker.
So I think one of our objectives by the next podcast is we identify our coworker.
Yes.
And that's we run with that, our imaginary coworker.
Our imaginary host that never shows up. And all of the ums come from that host. They just miraculously come from my voice. For some reason.
The other thing I wanted to say about that article too is it mentioned the little things, right? And the little things can be good, but also sometimes when you're in a confined space with the same person, just human psychology and that being quarantined together, sometimes the little things can be blown into big things as well. So it's you need to be mindful to, and everyone's gonna have their mechanisms for that. I think I try to use humor as much as possible to diffuse those things, make fun of myself rather than other people. That's a better way, because it lightens the other person's reaction to things. So just anybody, make fun of yourself. It's great. And people love that. People love self-deprecating people. So the next thing we were going to talk about is self. Well, we've talked about self a little bit, life a little bit.
Wait, no, actually, there's a couple more things in that article that I just wanted to mention. So they say establish routines, very common. I read it everywhere. Now, what they said, which we'll expand on in just a second, is don't just establish a routine, like change up the roles and responsibilities on a daily basis. Who's cooking, who's cleaning, who's doing the, you mentioned sharing homeschooling. This is crucial. Yep. We have so many unspoken ruts in our domestic life for multiple reasons on multiple levels across all genders and all ages. And this is a time to rethink, right? That, like we said about earlier, like everything has changed. Like let's rethink who does what. And let's rethink the value of the people in the home, because if health is the value, it's more important than the dollar, right? We're even having this debate, or at least that debate's happening in America, life, or a dollar. And it's just kind of like, let's think about this. I probably shouldn't talk politics. So I'm just going to stop going down that road, and I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Yep. Yeah. So, it's it's a conversation that needs to be had. And it's probably needed to be had for a very long time in many economies, countries around the world. So it's good that that's happening. That's the opportunity. Um, that's all I got to add about that. Do we
Well,
want
and
to?
so, yeah, well, you know what, because we actually need to start wrapping up. And the other kind of key topic we wanted to talk about today, we talked about some of the problems, and I hope we've kind of mentioned a few interesting solutions to those problems and some perspective out of this article and our point of view. But something that you and I are both concerned about, and I've always been concerned about in life, but in this situation, just want to make sure that we talk about, this is really just a continuation. You mentioned the little things, right? The little things can actually really kind of become big things.
Yep.
Little things becoming big things, and in many other situations, is where family violence can come from, right?
Yep.
Annoyances, people having a short fuse, children being in the home. Children are rambunctious. So we're, again, we're driving optimism, and we're concerned about how the potential for this crisis could impact domestic violence. So we just want to talk about some of the resources we found. And again, I'll pass it over to you. I know you found a lot of things in Australia. Australia seems to be out ahead of this, as well as Europe. And then we can talk about some interesting solutions maybe for New York here too.
Yep. So the Australia a couple days ago released some additional funding for a domestic violence initiative. So there, most of the states and territories in Australia manage those things themselves. Federal gives them funding, state gives them funding as well. So they've thrown $500 million towards things like this. New South Wales government has what's called the Violence, Abuse, and Neglect Services, and they have a COVID page out there that's providing some details about, are the services still available? Yes, they are. They are hesitant to move to more digital platforms because any in the home, in those relationships where there is violence, there's potential that those can be monitored, right, by the person. Yeah. So there's concerns about that, but they're still available. There's some resources out there, so please look in your community if you're listening. If you need them, the website. If you Google violence and abuse and neglect services (VAN) during COVID for New South Wales, it's one of the first links that come up.
And just use a private browser as a tip there.
Yeah, use a private browser. Don't save your cookies, because if somebody's monitoring your online activity, they'll see it. The things that they do talk about in what's in Australia, what's going on is there's a limited crisis accommodation, access to it quickly because there'll be increased demand. So I'm hoping that things like what's going on in France, where they're going to book hotels for families that need crisis accommodation. And the other thing, the concern is not that all inmates are violent to their partners, but there's probably going to be an influx of prison inmates released because prison communities are extremely vulnerable because of tight quarters for outbreaks. So some people who have minor crimes, things like that, will be released in the community. So there's concern about that. So please, if anybody is listening and you could be a victim, if you think that you can be a victim of violence, reach out to those resources. Shane, you did a bit of research in the US. Have you found anything?
Yeah, there's some hotlines, and I'll put a link in there. But I think the thing I wanted to say for the US is, and it maybe kind of goes back to your point about community. The community is like the people around you, as well as maybe the people that you interact with, or second level connections. And that's actually who I'm talking to. You may not be a victim of domestic violence yourself, but the reason why I'm so passionate about this topic is I'm grateful it didn't occur in my own family, but it occurred all around me when I was growing up. And I heard it every night. I heard people being beaten, and I cried just thinking about these people who were being abused. And I called the cops. So I'm someone who was an activist in these things, and this is where we're gonna have to be that way again. We're gonna have to be safe. We're gonna have to protect ourselves. But because, as you mentioned, people are monitored online and they're not able to make phone calls, they're not even able to leave their homes. Being able to reach out to someone who you think might be in an uncomfortable situation and privately let them know you're available to help. Is going to be very important. Very important. So, beyond those resources, I would say be aware and really just be exceptionally thoughtful and questioning and supportive of those who you think may have been stressed, right? And it's all, I mean, we could be the one needing that support very soon.
Yep.
And again, you mentioned that thing about the hotels. I mean, the hotels have been a very interesting concept during this whole situation about how they can be repurposed. And I think it's actually just a brilliant idea, because we can keep hotels open, we can keep people working. They're a safe place to go. We still have issues around security and anonymity and whatnot, because generally shelters are somewhat secure, but hey, this is much more important now. So
Yep.
we'll put a link to all those resources in the show notes, but we just want to make sure we call that awareness out. If you think there's an issue with violence, there's an issue with violence, right? So reach out to anyone, reach out to Jim and I on Twitter. We are here to help and point you the resources.
If there's any resources in your local community, share it with us and we'll share it more broadly as well.
Great. Hey, Jim, I want to thank you for your time today. Next week, we are going to talk with some friends of ours about how homeschooling is going during all of this and how parents are coping. So there should be some interesting topics coming up. So I look forward to it. You have a great day over there, the other side of the earth. And
yep, you do the same.
We'll talk to you soon, brother. Stay golden.
Respect.
Later.